1947. A mysterious flying object plunges from the sky and crashes in the desolate New Mexico desert. The otherworldly incident ignites a firestorm of speculation. Just exactly what was it that went down on the Foster Ranch outside of Roswell, New Mexico?
The reports of the debris suggest something otherworldly.
This was not of this earth.
I've lived with this for 50 years, and again, I'm not sure what it was, but I do know what it wasn't.
"50 years later, an official government report attempts to put the matter to rest.
The U.S. Air Force in 1994 said, everybody out of the way, we're going to investigate this. They did not research Roswell. It's a fraud.
Now, in 2002, archaeologists from the University of New Mexico have returned to Roswell with a unique new mission: to use the tools of modern science to prove or disprove what some claim is science fiction.
We are digging holes in the ground to look for physical evidence of an extraterrestrial vessel impact.
1,300 miles west in San Francisco, another researcher hopes that computer technology will decide once and for all who covered up the Roswell incident in 1947 and why.
I think this is indeed the smoking gun of Roswell that confirms there definitely were bodies recovered at Roswell.
I'm Bryant Gumbel. Stay with us for the Roswell crash, startling new evidence.
Should be coming up with pump house number 3.
Okay, that would be the pump and the windmill, and that's the water tank, I presume. That's it right there.
That's it.
All right.
Yes, we make a right here.
Okay, so we're going to go
right
down this
there.
road here.
We're 9/10 of a mile from the debris field.
The terrain is both beautiful and unforgiving. Hundreds of miles of desert scrub, sheep ranches, and the occasional tarantula. It's hard to believe that this remote stretch of New Mexico desert may hold the key to one of the greatest mysteries of the modern age.
I think it's just over this rise.
All righty.
It's starting to look familiar.
I'm Bryant Gumbel. The Roswell crash has become one of the most enduring mysteries of the post-atomic age. The facts are indisputable. In July of 1947, something fell from the skies, raining debris over the Foster Sheep Ranch, 75 miles northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. In a matter of days, that tiny cow town was awash in rumors of a crashed alien spacecraft. Though the U.S. government has repeatedly declared the case closed, a small group of dogged researchers have refused to let Roswell die. They're turning to modern technology and science to try and solve a mystery that's more than half a century old.
Tom, I can't believe you brought me here.
We're here.
Investigator Tom Carey is one man who's keeping his Roswell files open. Over the last 12 years, Carey and his research partner, Don Schmidt, have interviewed hundreds of first and second-hand witnesses. Carey and Schmidt have concluded that there is more than one side involved in the Roswell crash. The main focus of the dig is the debris field, some 75 miles outside of Roswell.
There are 3 sites. I'm standing in the middle of the so-called debris field, where we believe the vehicle, whatever it was, exploded and rained debris down on this pasture. And it's for this reason that we're conducting our archaeological dig at this site, because we stand to gain the most benefit from our efforts. There are 2 other sites related to the Roswell incident. 2.5 miles east of here, we believe there's a site where Mac Roswell found some bodies. And another 15 to 20 miles from that site, we believe the craft itself, or what was left of it, came down with perhaps 3 to 5 occupants.
University of New Mexico archaeologist Bill Dolman has agreed to oversee an archaeological dig, seeking hard evidence of the actual Roswell debris. You could call it forensic science fiction.
Everybody seems to agree that something happened in 1947 and that it involved a crash that left a mark and created debris. And there are many, 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 many stories and many, 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 many variations on those stories. The role of science in addressing this question really comes down to finding physical evidence. I can't say that enough times.
Phase 1 of the dig involves laying out a precise grid for the excavation site. Dolman and his team base their coordinates on research from Tom Carey and Don Schmidt, who have walked the site with witnesses and logged hundreds of hours of testimony.
Any crash investigators would suggest that no matter how top secret, no matter how secured a crash site, there will always remain pieces of debris, rivets, shards of material, something that decades later, archaeologists could go to the site and find evidence of.
I have no doubt that if there is an impact place and it is located, that science and scientific methods can find physical evidence of an impact.
Dolman and his team have now mapped out the dig site. With the where taken care of, the question remains, what was it that hit the Earth with such force that it created a debris field a mile long? The search for that answer begins in Roswell, New Mexico. It was there in July of 1947 that strange things began appearing in the nighttime skies. Hardware store owner Dan Wilmot and his wife were among the first to report seeing an unidentified flying object.
I think they were very credible witnesses. The Wilmots saw what they described as the classic flying saucer, like 2 wash bowls, one on top of the other, flying over on July 2nd, 1947 in Roswell.
Outside of Roswell, southwest of Highway 285, William Woody and his father reported seeing a fiery object descending toward Earth.
What's interesting about the Woody aspect of it is that he and his father, the next day or a day or 2 later, tried to go out to see if they could find where the thing fell and ran into the military cordon. So we've got an interesting little corroboration there. The military was interested in it and they were turned back by the cordons.
The Wilmots and the Woodies were not alone in their sightings.
Other observers have reported seeing things in the sky roughly the same time, all flying in different directions.
People driving down the highway from Vaughn and from Santa Fe coming towards Roswell saw the thing disappear behind the hills out there, about 35 miles north of town, then to the west, a series of little rolling hills. So you couldn't see when it crashed.
Some eyewitnesses believed it was an airplane that's seen falling from the sky. But there are no records of any airplane crashes outside of Roswell for that weekend in 1947.
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that what crashed outside of Roswell was an extraterrestrial craft.
Proof of such an extraterrestrial crash is now dependent upon good science and state-of-the-art imaging technology.
Sid, here's your mark.
On day 3 of the dig, geophysicist David Heinemann oversees an electromagnetic conductivity study at the Foster Ranch.
This is hardly my normal run-of-the-mill piece of work. I usually work supporting engineers and scientists or geologists on a piece of civil work or looking for groundwater. This job is challenging. It pushes my art and my science and gives me a chance to exercise an open mind.
Heinemann and his assistant conclude their investigation by tracking the field with a metal detector. The metal detector registers an unusually high number of strong hits that could be debris. But Heinemann is still skeptical.
It would take more than the stories of well-intentioned eyewitnesses. I believe that finding a piece of material, an actual piece of debris, which lacked other explanation, would be very powerful.
When the Roswell crash startling new evidence returns, Heinemann's study reveals hot spots in the debris field that may be evidence of an extraterrestrial crash. And new Roswell witnesses share their stories of that famous night in '47 and its 55-year aftermath.
It was a gray, but it was a weird gray. It was nothing I'd ever seen before or ever have seen since.
We loaded it, and the 3 MPs come inside the airplane and got on top of that box. And we took off and flew it to Fort Worth.
I wanted to get my retirement in. I didn't want to get kicked out or didn't want to go to Fort Leavenworth. So I kept my mouth shut about all this.
The Roswell crash, startling new evidence, will return in a moment. By now, the story's familiar. A mysterious object crashes in the middle of the New Mexico desert, only to be recovered, some say covered up, by the United States government. Was it a weather balloon? Was it a Russian spy plane? Or was it, as many people claim, an extraterrestrial spacecraft? The search for hard evidence of the Roswell crash begins at the International UFO Museum in downtown Roswell. There, archaeologist Bill Dolman introduces his team of volunteers to what will become their holy grail, HUMUOs, his own made-up acronym for what he's termed historic materials of uncertain origin.
If this thing, something came and plowed into the surface and created a gouge, all right, and this gouge filled in with sediment over the last 55 years with rain washing down the slopes and stuff like that, then there could be stuff down here that's now buried. Or if there was a hole here and a piece came flying through the air and went and ended up down there, that would be part of it, and it would eventually get buried when this little kangaroo rat finally passed on to the next plane, and his hole filled in with dirt, and down there at the bottom of it is a HUMUO.
Leaving Roswell at the crack of dawn, the dig team makes its way out to the debris field. The pasture where ranch foreman Mac Brazel found a field of otherworldly debris 55 years ago.
And the center line of the grid system was set up with advice from Tom Carey and Don Schmidt as the best known location for where the furrow was, where whatever impacted hit and scooted along and left a gouge and then flew back up in the air. Tom?
The furrow's up there. The red flag.
Right.
It comes down this way.
And it comes down through here.
So the trajectory was...
Elsewhere on the dig site, David Heinemann's electromagnetic conductivity study has revealed 2 notable anomalies, areas that show strikingly unusual soil characteristics. The anomalies are located right where witness testimony placed the gouge created by whatever crashed here in 1947.
The red colors represent high conductivity. That's likely to reflect any subsurface features that might be the gouge or furrow that we're looking for. And so our plan is to begin with targeting the two major anomalies with test pits that you're going to be digging today and continuing to dig until you fall down.
Volunteer Nancy Easley Johnston has come all the way from Colorado to participate in the dig. Her father, the late Major Edwin Easley, was Provost Marshal of the Roswell Army Air Base in 1947. He supervised the cleanup of this very site.
It's probably true that we wouldn't be here looking the way we are with a fine-tooth comb, so to speak, had it not been for the good job that my father and his men and the other people who were involved did in cleaning up the site.
Citing a vow he made to President Truman, Easley never told his family what happened all those years ago. This is the first time his daughter has ever talked publicly about the Roswell incident.
The reason that I came to participate in looking for whatever might be out here is, gosh, we know something happened. And I'd love to know. If I don't learn it in this lifetime, I'm going to have a conversation with my father one of these days to answer all those questions.
And more of these military officers who heretofore would only tell us that they were sworn to secrecy, that they still couldn't talk about it, would then finally say, well, I've waited all these years, and yet I feel that at least I owe you this much, and then would acknowledge that it wasn't a balloon, it was a flying saucer, it was something manufactured off the Earth.
If the Roswell story is indeed true, how could so many salt-of-the-earth people keep such a secret for more than half a century?
The military may have suggested to specific witnesses who saw something that they really rather they didn't talk about it and appeal to their patriotism, which in 1947 would have worked really well. We were talking different times and different eras, and I think we're dealing with people who were very honorable people in 1947.
It was during the early 1940s that American flyboys first encountered mysterious objects that would later be classified as UFOs.
It is in World War II where sightings of UFOs really spiked up in a very significant way. They encountered these glowing balls of light, for instance, that would pace a plane going at 300, 400 miles per hour and then shoot up in the sky. No one really knew what these were.
Dubbed Foo Fighters, these strange balls of light were initially believed to be some form of psychological warfare developed by the Nazis.
Foo Fighters were observed in the Pacific Theater as well as the European Theater. And they were observed by American, French, British pilots as well as German and Japanese pilots. You know, who do they belong to? What are they? No one really knew.
These encounters didn't end with the war. In 1947, Americans found their skies filled with all sorts of strange flying objects.
The UFO phenomenon really took off actually in June of 1947 in the state of Washington, when a pilot by the name of Kenneth Arnold saw many objects going in formation at a very, very high speed by Mount Rainier in Washington.
Arnold said that the 9 silvery objects he'd seen looked like saucers skipping over a pond. The next day, his story was front-page news, and a new term entered the American lexicon: flying saucer. Today, the term flying saucer seems outdated and comical, but in 1947, it was no laughing matter.
The government was panicked about UFOs. They didn't know what it was. Here's this phenomenon invading our airspace. They're unable to do anything about it. So there was a high level of panic. What if this happens to be alien invaders? They can't prepare for it.
The UFO problem has had very significant national security implications. You can look at other incidents regarding UFOs in the military in the 1940s. For instance, airspace violations over very sensitive places, including the Oak Ridge nuclear facility in Tennessee. You know, I don't know about you, but I would want to know what was invading my airspace. And you know what? They did want to know. And we have FBI documents that confirm tremendous interest by the Atomic Energy Commission, by Army intelligence.
Following the Kenneth Arnold incident, UFO reports poured in from all across the nation. Many of these originated in New Mexico, and for good reason. New Mexico's skies were prime testing grounds for the Army's top-secret weapons.
New Mexico was the hotbed of all military activity. There was more atomic research here, all of the V-2 German rocket testing happening just about an hour west of this very site, ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos, and the first atomic bomb squadron headquartered at Roswell. I mean, this was the unit, the squadron, that had dropped the atomic bomb.
It was in Roswell on the night of July 2nd, 1947, that the Wilmots and the Woodies first glimpsed a mysterious flying object plummeting towards Earth. 75 miles northwest of town, rancher W.W. Mac Brazel awakened to an ear-splitting explosion. The next morning, he mounted up his horse and set out to investigate. The plain-spoken 49-year-old cowboy had no idea that he was about to ride into history and into one of the most perplexing mysteries of the 20th century. The Roswell crash, startling new evidence, will return in a moment. "75 miles outside of Roswell, the team of archaeologists and volunteers are about to break ground at the Foster Ranch. The hope is that 6 days of digging and sifting will finally answer the question, what really fell to earth there in July of 1947?
This is the first penetration of the ground by excavation equipment on the Foster Ranch dig in September of 2002. Okay, dishpan. And you find weird-looking things and you put them on the side.
The land that Dolman and his volunteers are excavating hasn't changed much since 1947. Back then, Foster Ranch foreman Mac Brazel didn't have a team of archaeologists or a metal detector. All the 49-year-old cowboy had was his eyes, ears, and years of experience running a ranch. In all that time, he'd never seen anything like what he discovered on that steamy July morning.
The whole thing had the appearance of something that had blown up high in the air and then fallen down.
Whatever it was, the sheep wouldn't cross. So he had to divert them a mile around for them to water.
The strange wreckage that Brazel discovered spanned an area 300 yards wide by a mile long. That parcel of land, known to investigators as the debris field, is where some believe an extraterrestrial craft blew apart and fell to Earth. At the time, Mac Brazel didn't know what to make of the rubble that was strewn across his ranch. He grabbed some smaller pieces of the material and showed it to some neighbors. Like Brazel, they'd never seen anything like it.
It's a piece of what we call memory metal. You can't cut it, scratch it, burn it, or deform it in any way. It will always return to the flat surface.
Brazel would visit one of his neighbors at that time, Sally Tetralini. And as he would pull from his leather chaps a piece of that very material. And before her eyes, as he would crumble it and open his hand and back and forth, and she would watch as it would always smooth right out. And her lasting impression was, even from that very moment, wouldn't it be great if clothes could be made of such material so I would never have to iron again?
One of my favorite Roswell witnesses, what he said was, I never seen nothing that was so thin and so light, but you couldn't bend. I says, God Almighty, what the hell is this? And that's the essence of it. God Almighty, what the hell is this?
That night, Brazel dropped into a local bar and once again shared the tale of his extraordinary discovery. His buddies there told him of the recent wave of UFO sightings. Someone suggested there might even be a cash reward for the wreckage he'd stumbled upon.
I think Mac was just a plain, straightforward cowboy who thought he found something unusual and who may have had some hope for a reward, because at that time, with all of the excitement during the initial flying saucer flap, something like $3,000 total was being offered for physical evidence of what these flying saucer things are. So he was probably motivated by that and just basic patriotism to bring this stuff in.
What blows the lid completely off this is when the rancher, Mac Brazel, comes to the Chavez County Sheriff's Office, reports to Sheriff George Wilcox that there's this huge debris field of unknown origin that he cannot identify.
While Brazel was at the sheriff's office, a call came in from Roswell DJ and newsman Frank Joyce. It was a slow news day, and Joyce was looking for a scoop.
The sheriff puts a man on the line, and it turns out to be W.W. Brazel. He's quite upset, and as the conversation went along, there were some rather sensational subjects came up, and I ultimately recommended that he go to the Roswell Army Air Force Base and give this information to those people, as they were flyers and would know what to do about anything that flies.
Colonel William Butch Blanchard, the commanding officer of the Roswell Army Air Base, ordered Major Jesse Marcel to investigate Mac Brazel's discovery.
Jesse Marcel Sr. had a very important job. He was the staff intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group, which was the only atomic bomb delivery unit in the whole world.
It was his job to investigate aircraft accidents or anything of that nature. So it was not unusual for him to be called out for field duty.
Major Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett traveled to the Foster Ranch and spent a day gathering the strange wreckage. Marcel was so intrigued by the debris that on his way back to the base, he stopped by his home to show his family what he'd found.
My dad came into my room very excited, and he wanted to show us some material that he'd found. I think the inclination or intimation there was this was part of a flying saucer. Out of all the debris that I saw that night, the strangest thing that I recall seeing was the beam or the I-beam.
Years later, Jesse Marcel Jr. commissioned an artist to recreate the mysterious I-beam.
I recall picking it up like this and looking at the inside surface and seeing the symbols. The color, the purple-violet hue. I have not seen anything that looked like that before nor since.
The strange hieroglyphic-like symbols left the Marcel family with the eerie feeling that something extraterrestrial had indeed crashed outside of their small New Mexico town. Had a flying saucer really fallen into the Army's hands? And if so, what were they going to tell the American public? When we return, archaeologists take extreme precautions to ensure the integrity of the dig site.
If debris comes out of here, we don't want anybody able to say that the site had been salted.
And relatives of Roswell witnesses come forward to share their stories.
My niece kept asking him, well, Pappy, what did you see out there? What'd you see? What'd you see? And finally he said, creatures.
The Roswell crash, startling new evidence. We'll return in a moment. 5 of the Roswell crash excavation. Archaeologists and volunteers are taking soil samples from every sediment layer and bagging and cataloging humuos, hoping they may be pieces of extraterrestrial debris. With each new find, however, head archaeologist Bill Dolman steps up precautions to keep the dig site secure.
One of my main missions here was to ensure the integrity of this entire operation. If debris comes out of here, we don't want anybody able to say that the site had been salted. Salting is a term for putting things in the site to make it seem as if they were there when they really weren't there. That's why there was security out here, to make sure that nobody disturbed it.
Okay, Vicki, I want you to step in front. We had specific security concerns given the fact that there's a lot of notoriety with the incident in Roswell. Every person that's involved with this group are signed to confidentiality agreements. We maintain access control, identification of people when they come and go. Yes, does anybody scheduled to come in? We have a vehicle coming in. Okay, we're going to move to intercept. You guys have permission to be out here?
Yeah, we're the photographers.
You have some identification on you, sir?
Right.
You have a photo ID. You need something with your picture on it. Captain Scott, security to Bill or Larry. Come in, please. You have to maintain a secure perimeter. You have to maintain secure custody and chain of custody on any items that are recovered here.
Debris collected from the Foster Ranch back in 1947 followed a much more shadowy chain of custody. Major Jesse Marcel delivered the bizarre material to his commanding officer, Colonel William Blanchard, who then ordered Marcel to hand deliver it to 8th Air Force Commander General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth, Texas. Robert J. Shirky, Assistant Group Operations Officer for the 509th Bomb Group, received Blanchard's B-29 requisition.
On the day in question, Colonel Blanchard had come into operations office and asked, "Where's my airplane?" And I told him, and I said, "It's parked right out on the ramp." And it was a B-29. That he stepped back in the doorway and waved his hand and said, "Come on through." Major Marcel was one of the people coming through holding a box that had some aluminum type looking pieces of metal. And in the corner of his box was one of the I-beams that everyone talks about.
In 1947, George Newling was a 17-year-old flight mechanic at the Roswell Army Air Base. Newling was one of the last soldiers at Roswell to get a look at the B-29's unusual cargo. After 55 years of silence, he's agreed to be interviewed for our program.
I got to the airplane, there was MPs standing around it with machine guns. That was very weird. They just checked my pass, and I went on in the aircraft. And that's when I spotted this object. It was a gray, but it was a weird gray. It was nothing I'd ever seen before, or ever have seen since. I was standing there with my mouth open, looking at it. Well, that's when they escorted me down to the provost marshal. He said, "Just forget what you seen and go on back to barracks and don't go back on the line."
Robert Slusher, an airman with the 509th, was a member of a second B-29 flight crew at the Roswell Air Base. After Marcel left for Fort Worth with the wreckage, Slusher and his crew departed with a payload that was even more mysterious.
It's a box. It was probably 11 foot long, probably 5 foot wide. We loaded it, and the 3 MPs come inside the airplane and got on top of that box. And we took off and flew it to Fort Worth. On the way back, Lieutenant Martucci says, "Boys, we've just made history." What he meant by it, I have no idea. And then when they got back, they just said, "This is a classified mission. Don't talk." So the next day, the rumor got out, said you flew the bodies back to Fort Worth.
back at the debris field, Provost Marshal Major Edwin Easley's main concern was to find any remaining debris. Under orders from Colonel Blanchard, he supervised a thorough cleanup of the area.
My father was asked to bring a contingent of men out here and secure the site to keep people from coming to the site. And later on, it's my understanding that he and his men cleaned the site and took away whatever was here.
They basically grabbed anybody who was free to come out here to actually get down on their hands and knees to pick up the pieces of debris.
Blanchard's next step was perhaps even more puzzling. He contacted 25-year-old public relations officer Walter Hott.
I went up to headquarters, and he told me that we had in our possession pieces of a flying saucer. Told me what he wanted in a press release. This was information that was given to me by the base commander, and when he told me to do something, that was it. If the boss man said that we had a flying saucer in our possession, we had one, and that was it.
Hott hand-delivered the release to the local newspapers and radio stations, then went home for lunch. By the next morning, the story was worldwide news.
The phone was ringing off the hook all over Roswell, at the base, the sheriff's office, radio station, newspapers, etc. This is 2 weeks after the big noise began about flying saucers. Headlines all over the 44 states there were sightings.
Meanwhile, after arriving at Fort Worth, Texas with his mysterious cargo, Major Jesse Marcel debriefed General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force, on the sequence of events thus far.
According to Marcel, General Ramey took him to the map room and said, point out where you found this stuff. And Marcel was a map maker by profession. We came back and they laid out this weather balloon while he wasn't there. He was taken completely by surprise. He didn't realize that they were going to pull this switch on him.
Ramey had gotten a call from a general at the Pentagon to get the press off their back. And Ramey had come up with the idea of substituting wreckage from a weather balloon. And so Ramey told the press that all this stuff was simply a weather balloon. And that was what most of the press published the next day.
They never saw the real material. The real material went on to Washington at that time. So Marcel is ordered to pose with the substituted radar reflector balloon. So the first press release that it was a flying saucer, and 6 hours later, we're sorry, ladies and gentlemen, it's just a weather balloon. The question is, which press release is the true story?
The next day you had stories like Ramey washes out Roswell saucer, or words to that effect.
By the time Marcel returned home to his family, Ramey had made his orders clear.
When he came back in, he was very serious about never describing this again. Treat this as a non-event, didn't happen. Don't talk about this with your friends. Just don't let them know anything at all unusual happened, which, of course, I obeyed. We didn't even discuss it amongst ourselves for quite a while.
When we return, the Roswell case goes underground, only to resurface with more tales of government cover-ups, disappearing records, and alien bodies.
After 2.5 years of studying this, I think this is indeed the smoking gun of Roswell that confirms what the witnesses had been telling us about bodies being recovered at Roswell. And there has indeed been a cover-up of what happened.
Just a weather balloon. That was the U.S. Army's official explanation for what crashed outside of Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. In the months and years that followed, the military launched a PR offensive aimed at reassuring anxious Americans that the skies were safe from alien invaders.
It does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate to any conceivable threat to the United States.
Public interest in the last few years has increased very greatly in the phenomenon which has been identified as flying saucers. These stories have led to much fiction and much fancy.
At the time, no one questioned the military story. With the Second World War only a couple of years behind them, patriotic Americans trusted their government. If Uncle Sam said there were no UFOs, there were no UFOs. If it was indeed the crash of an extraterrestrial spacecraft, why was the government going to such great lengths to cover it up?
Let us hypothesize that the year is 1947 and that your name is Harry Truman. And let us further hypothesize that your military somehow obtained crash wreckage of some kind of technology that wasn't your own and that wasn't Soviet. The question is, what would you do about it? Well, we know in 1947, for instance, that the U.S. had a monopoly of nuclear technology, of working atomic bombs, and we know that the entire world was hammering at the door of the United Nations to get the United States to make atomic technology public, that is, to put it under the control of the United Nations. The U.S. response to that was absolutely no way are we going to share nuclear technology with anyone. If they're not going to share nuclear technology in 1947, what on earth are they going to do about something as exotic as alien technology? Well, I think the answer would be clear. You would make it so secret, you would in a sense almost keep it secret from yourself.
Following General Roger Ramey's press conference on July 8, 1947, it appeared that the Roswell incident was successfully dead and buried.
After 1947, through about 1978, very little was done on the Roswell case. There were mentions here and there were references to it. Usually if it was referenced, it was suggested it was a hoax or a misidentification.
The Roswell craze was launched anew in 1978, when investigators Stanton Friedman and Len Stringfield stumbled upon a little-known retired Army officer named Jesse Marcel. After 31 years, Marcel had finally decided to break his silence on the Roswell incident.
He tells me the story about being the intelligence officer at the base here in Roswell, getting a call from the sheriff's office, going out with the counterintelligence corps man, with the rancher who would come in with pieces of this weird stuff, following them out because there's no way to tell anybody where that debris field is, and seeing all this stuff strewn out of an area 3/4 of a mile long, a few hundred feet wide.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all our activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was. There were just fragments strewn all over the area, so we proceeded to pick up the parts. A lot of it had a lot of little members with symbols that, to me, I call them hieroglyphics because I could not interpret them, could not be read. They were just like symbols of something that meant something. These little members could not be broken, could not be burned. I even tried to burn that, would not burn. See, that stuff weighs nothing. It's not any thicker than tinfoil in a pack of cigarettes.
Yeah, my dad never changed the story. He was convinced this came from some other place, though, meaning another solar system. He never divulged what he thought it was, except, well, the flying saucer thing, whatever that meant.
By the time Marcel went public with his story in 1978, many of the key witnesses in the Roswell mystery had long since passed away. Rancher W.W. Mac Brazel, the man who led Marcel to the debris field, died in 1963. Despite Brazel's death, his story lived on, thanks in large part to other witnesses, like Frank Joyce. In the late 1970s, Joyce first elaborated on Mac Brazel's role in the Roswell incident. Joyce told investigators that within a day or two of Brazel finding the wreckage, the rancher changed his story after being detained by the military for several days.
He comes into the station and he said, "We've discovered that this was a weather balloon." he said, I was told to come and tell you this story or it would go hard with me, meaning him, and then I advised him that they couldn't tell him what to do, that nobody is going to be able to put pressure on him. And after making my little speech, again in that very quiet voice, Brazel says, I'm not so sure of that.
Joyce also claims that the cowboy found more than space-age debris out in the desert. The retired newsman says that Brazel saw dead alien bodies.
I said this, he didn't. Little green men. And without me saying another word comes the quiet voice from the corner, they weren't green. So that was the first time that he really shook me on, hey, those bodies he's talking about must have been there.
The question of alien bodies has fascinated Roswell investigators for years. Based upon his research, Tom Carey speculates that alien bodies were found 2.5 miles from the debris field and at an impact site some 20 miles away.
We're talking up to 8 bodies that we believe were involved in the crash. We also have testimony from a number of people that at least one was alive, perhaps 2, when the military got here.
There are no known living witnesses who claim to have seen the bodies with their own eyes. Most of the testimony collected by investigators comes via second-hand witnesses, like Roswell mortician Glenn Dennis. Dennis says he learned about the alien bodies when he ran into an Army nurse that he knew. She was hysterical and told him she had just been forced to assist in an alien autopsy.
What they wanted her to do was to write down what they were examining, and said there was a trash bag that was open with 2 very mutilated small bodies that looked like kind of ancient Chinese. On another gurney, there was the limbs and everything were severed, but the torso, they would take a forceps and turn overhand, and they would describe so many centimeters, 4 fingers, little pads, looked like little pads on with little miniature suction cups. The heads were very large, pliable like newborn children, and their eyes were very large.
Dennis claimed that while at the base, his life was threatened by an officer.
There was another captain standing there, and he came up and he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, don't go in and start a bunch of rumors. So I didn't like his attitude, and I said, I'm a civilian, you can't do anything to me, you can go to hell. And that's when he really punched me a little bit, and he said, somebody will be picking your bones out of the sand if you do.
There are other Roswell citizens who recall eerily similar events. Today, Pete and Mary Anaya are fixtures in New Mexico Democratic politics. But in July of 1947, they were a young working-class couple in Roswell. At the time, Anaya was a cook at the base. He says his good friend Joseph Montoya, then Lieutenant Governor of New Mexico, also saw the alien corpses.
My brother used to know him real good, and so did me. He came down one time to campaign for Lieutenant Governor, so he told me and Ruben to take him to the base. He came out and he told us he saw 3 little men, the head about that big. And then he said they were funny-looking bodies. He didn't want to talk no more. He was really, really, really upset.
Anaya says that Montoya was so shaken up that he asked to go to his house for a drink. Anaya's wife Mary was the next person to hear the Lieutenant Governor's tale of dead aliens.
He took some drinks, and I mean, not only 1 or 2, it was quite a bit. He was pretty shaken. We wanted to know more, because I didn't want to believe that, at the first I didn't want to believe that they had seen little people.
Once he calmed down, Montoya refused to discuss the matter in public ever again. Like Glenn Dennis, Anaya says his and his brother's lives were later threatened. The sinister message was allegedly delivered from the airbase by Sheriff George Wilcox.
The sheriff came in and talked to me and him, and I told the sheriff what's going on. And then the sheriff told us, you better keep your mouth shut, because if you won't keep your mouth shut, you're going to get killed.
Perhaps the most compelling story about the alien bodies is attributed to the late Major Edwin Easley, who served as the Provost Marshal of Roswell Army Airfield in 1947. His youngest daughter, Nancy, a dig volunteer, tells of her father's reluctance to discuss the Roswell incident.
Whenever we would ask him about Roswell, he would simply tell us that he had promised President Truman that he would not talk about it. He kept his word. He wouldn't engage in these conversations until he was dying. He was already on high doses of morphine. My niece kept asking him, well, Pappy, what did you see out there? What'd you see? What'd you see? And finally he said, creatures.
At one point in a conversation, I said to him, are we following the right path? And he said, what do you mean? I said, we think it's extraterrestrial. And he said, well, let me put it this way, it's not the wrong path. I think Edwin Easley's testimony is important because it leads sort of to the bodies, it gives us a hint to the importance the military attached to it, and it gives us a lead about how important the administration thought it was.
A key to proving that bodies were actually recovered from the crash is to find the impact site itself. According to Kevin Randall, finding proof of bodies and the impact site will be a tall order for even the most seasoned investigator.
Unfortunately, some of the witnesses that we had put some trust in turned out not to be as credible as we had hoped for. We know that there was a second site, and there may have been a third or a fourth site, depending on how the thing broke up. But we just don't have someone who was standing on the site and could point, yes, it landed here, and the bodies were here, and this was there.
Don Schmidt and Tom Carey are determined to find the impact site. Today they'll take to the air in search of the final resting place of the ill-fated spacecraft.
Don, it should be on your side when we get there.
When we return, Schmidt and Carey continue their search for the infamous impact site and new tales of the victims of the Roswell crash.
One picture showed 3 dead aliens laying side by side, apparently on some kind of a canvas or cloth, and showed 2 others standing side by side. I assumed they were the ones that lived.
The Roswell crash, startling new evidence, will return in a moment. Schmidt and Tom Carey have spent more than a decade investigating the Roswell incident. Today, they're looking for the final impact site, some 20 miles southeast of the debris field. So far, the going has been difficult.
The range road should be to your right.
We should actually see it circle south and then cut back.
They are looking for a fallen windmill, an X that supposedly marks the spot of the flying saucer's final resting place. It was there that eyewitnesses claimed to have seen the deceased alien crew and a spacecraft that was mostly intact. The belief that this second site even exists is largely based upon the testimony of retired Brigadier General Arthur E. Exon.
General Exon, who was assigned to the base in 1947, flew over the 2 sites outside of Roswell. We have him on tape saying there were 2 distinct sites. The one further northwest was mainly metallic debris, which describes the Brazel Ranch, and the other site that was closer to town, that was where the main body of the craft was found. And he talks about gouges in the terrain, and he talks about tire tracks in the areas, showing that there had been a real activity to clean this stuff up.
Pinpointing the exact location of a fallen windmill is but one of the many difficulties investigators have encountered over the years. Author and researcher Richard Dolan says the UFO field is like a hall of mirrors.
You have real documents, you have fake documents, you have real claims, you have claims that can't be verified. Where is truth? There is truth in there. finding out what that is not always easy.
Many investigators believe that the ultimate proof of extraterrestrial visits can be found in Washington, D.C. Over the years, the government has released a number of documents that indicate they took the threats of UFOs very seriously. In the months following the Roswell event, high-ranking military officers like Colonel Howard McCoy waxed enthusiastic about UFOs in confidential memos.
He says, you might be surprised to know that because of the excitement of last summer about the so-called flying saucers, we now have a project called SCI looking into this. We have hundreds of sightings by very credible witnesses. We're very concerned about this, and I cannot tell you how much we wish one of these things would crash someplace where we could recover it.
Project SCI eventually became Project Blue Book, a government investigation of UFO sightings spanning more than 20 years. Even though Blue Book confirms 701 sightings that could not be explained, the program was shut down in 1969.
Since the closing of Project Blue Book in 1969, the United States Air Force has issued fundamentally the same statement about UFOs. We undertook a 20-some-odd-year study of UFOs. We didn't find anything to be unusual or threatening the national security. Therefore, on the basis of that, we close Project Blue Book and we don't investigate UFOs. That is the official truth, you might say. All cultures have an official truth, and all cultures have unofficial truths.
It is that shadowy line between the official and unofficial truth that has led millions of Americans to believe that the government is not telling us everything it knows about UFOs. According to Washington, D.C. Attorney Daniel Sheehan, even the highest elected officials have been stonewalled in their search for life out there.
Based on what I've been told, is that immediately after President Carter was elected, he contacted the then sitting director of the Central Intelligence Agency, who was George Bush Sr. at the time, and asked to be briefed on and provided information about the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. And George Bush Sr. refused to give it to him.
While working as a special consultant to the Congressional Research Service, Sheehan gained access to classified sections of Project Blue Book.
That's where I actually saw the photographs of, indisputably, a UFO craft that had crashed, and they had United States Air Force personnel in the photographs measuring it and taking photographs of it and everything. And I actually saw a close-up shot of certain designs, insignia that were on the side of the craft. Some kind of hieroglyphics.
Recently, Mo Cox, a retired United States Air Force sergeant, came forward claiming that he too saw classified photos from Project Blue Book. This is the only on-camera interview he's ever given.
We were all top secret crypto cleared, and the information that we had in our heads would have been extremely valuable to foreign nations. Major took me back, opened the file cabinet. He said, look here. On the front of the drawer, it said Operation Blue Book. He said, this might interest you, in big old thick photo. Roswell, 47. One picture showed 3 dead aliens laying side by side, apparently on some kind of a canvas or cloth, and showed 2 others standing side by side. I assumed they were the ones that lived.
According to Cox, the file also contained photos of the crashed spacecraft.
Saucer, as they call it, was not round as it's been depicted in most cases. It was more egg-shaped front to rear, from what little I could see. The whole back right corner was missing, just a big nothing. I was counseled just before I retired that I would keep my mouth shut to what I knew, or forget it, I was Fort Leavenworth bound. I didn't want to go to Fort Leavenworth, so I kept my mouth shut about all this until, I guess about a year, a little better ago. I finally figured it's time somebody knew that it really did happen.
During the 1980s and 90s, investigators filed numerous Freedom of Information Act claims in an effort to have such information declassified. Their efforts were unsuccessful.
Here it is. Perfectly normal looking, top secret plus. You never see the plus. That special compartmented information. We expected a little censorship, and it's not too surprising that there's some blacked out stuff. But then it gets so darn heavy. And it's truly laughable. You're telling me there's no cover-up? This isn't the documents, remember? This is the justification for withholding the documents. Somebody actually went through and measured this stuff, and it's 75% blacked out.
Ironically, the government has rejected numerous Freedom of Information requests, citing national security concerns. This despite their earlier findings with Project Blue Book that UFOs pose no significant security threat. In 1993, at the urging of the late New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff and the Government Accounting Office, the Air Force agreed to investigate the Roswell incident. They released their findings in 1994.
Finally, they came down to this Project Mogul balloons that were being launched at Alamogordo starting in early June of 1947.
The Mogul was a classified project, and it was a very important project. The function of Mogul back then was to send aloft balloons with special equipment that would be able to detect when the Soviets detonated an atomic device.
C.B. Moore was a physicist working on Project Mogul in 1947.
We used a long train of about 28 balloons, and radar targets consisted of aluminum foil laminated onto a fairly tough parchment-like white paper, and they were deployed on sticks of balsa wood.
Moore and his colleagues launched the first of these Mogul balloons on June 4th, 1947. They eventually lost track of the balloons. Moore believes they fell to Earth on the Foster Ranch, only to be found by Mac Brazel.
I think this was some sort of comedy of mistaken identity. The people at Roswell had no idea what we were doing. The rancher apparently got the idea that he had recovered a flying saucer.
Research scientist Dave Rudiak has a hard time believing that experienced military personnel would mistake weather balloons and radar targets for a flying saucer.
The materials used in the Mogul balloon were off-the-shelf weather materials. This is a small weather balloon I picked up at a Army surplus store. And any child knows what a balloon looks like. And this mysterious foil paper that they made the radar targets from is the same stuff that Hershey had been wrapping their candy bars with since before 1920. It was a common consumer product for over 30 years before Roswell. And so unless the guys at Roswell never had candy bars or chewing gum, they would have been pretty familiar with it.
I have a difficult time believing that Jesse Marcel, as the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic strike force in the world at the time, was so incompetent that he couldn't identify weather balloon remains when he saw them.
In 1997, the 50th anniversary of the Roswell incident, the Air Force issued its final word on the subject. The Roswell report, Case Closed, addressed the question of eyewitness reports of alien bodies.
Their second final report was to deal with the bodies, and they came up with anthropomorphic dummies that they were using to test ejection systems and parachutes from high altitudes, which is fine, but the test didn't begin until 1953, 6 years after this event, so it makes no sense.
So whom should we believe? Was it a weather balloon and crash dummies, as the Air Force has claimed? Or was it something extraterrestrial? Research scientist Dave Rudiak thinks he has the answer. A 55-year-old photo that he believes to be the smoking gun of the Roswell incident.
And this is General Ramey. In his hand, he's holding this message, which is so important.
The image is of sufficient quality that we can read quite a bit of the message. And it tells a very remarkable story.
When we return, Dave Rudiak uses computer technology to reveal the contents of General Ramey's top-secret memo. The Roswell crash, startling new evidence. We'll return in a moment.
Doesn't look like there's a two-track running up to it.
Bill Dolman brings his crew out to examine a strange geological feature he's noticed just about a quarter of a mile from the dig site.
And this... Jiminy Christmas. This feature behind us is very visible from the road. And probably the first or second day we were working out here, we noticed it on the side of the road and everybody went, "Oh, what the heck is that?" Well, this alternative furrow, I'm going to call it the alternative furrow, is 70 degrees east of true north. 54 degrees difference. Something disturbed the ground there in a wide enough area to initiate a 30-meter-long erosional feature. Then it wasn't a cow path, and it wasn't a two-track, and it wasn't a natural drainage because it doesn't go down slope. It cuts across the slope. We have an anomaly here.
Dolman and his team map and measure the new anomaly for future study. Since it lies so close to the generally accepted location of the debris field, could the fading memories of now deceased witnesses have been off by a quarter of a mile or so?
We came out here to investigate a furrow that nobody can see on the surface. One of the major questions we started with is, where is that furrow? And if they had taken me to this feature and said, this is the furrow, I would have gone, oh, yeah, there's something there. While you guys are getting ready to map this thing, I'm just going to cruise around here and see if I can find anything else.
Okay.
Oh my golly gosh, it's a freaking weather balloon. And I was just completely surprised and thought it was hugely ironic that right around the corner we have a furrow and a weather balloon.
Dolman's discovery of a weather balloon might be more than just ironic. It could mean that the Air Force's original explanation of the Roswell crash was correct after all.
Should the case ever develop that we would find anything conventional suggesting that it was part of the Air Force theory as to what actually transpired out here, we would first of all rely on the background, the experience of the archaeologists involved to establish the provenance of that material. Was it something that was here dating back around 50, 55 years? Or is there the possibility it was something planted much more recently?
Do I think it could date back to 1947? It's hard to say. I think that if you notice how the grass is kind of growing through here, and the fact that when I try and lift it, it's sort of stuck to the ground. Stuff has been growing into it for a while.
While Dolman waits for the National Weather Service to assess the balloon's age, he oversees the final phase of the project at the original debris field dig site, backhoe excavation of carefully selected sections of the field.
The backhoe trenching is kind of the last phase of investigative activity. But we can look at a backhoe trench just like this one in the side of it, look at the stratigraphy that shows up in it, and see whether or not there's evidence of a furrow. We so far have found absolutely no evidence of the furrow.
As the end of the dig draws near, scientists at Foster Ranch have yet to uncover definitive physical evidence of a crash. And even the most dedicated UFO researchers admit they've yet to get their hands on any solid proof that refutes the government's explanation of what happened at Roswell.
I think we're back where we started. We're back to the original story. We're back to the Air Force's, the Army Air Force's reaction to what was found, which is all out of proportion for anything that would be mundane.
Rumors grew that they might even be fantastic invaders from another planet. But now they tell us it was just a lot of balloons.
UFO researcher and author Carl Flock considers himself a former Roswell believer who has now become a skeptic.
I'm very, very sympathetic with people who find it difficult to let go of Roswell, if you will. There is this kind of natural human tendency to begin to discount the things that you really don't want to hear and to emphasize the things you really do want to hear, and I kind of think of this as the will to believe, if you will. And I went through that with Roswell.
Over the years, skeptics' arguments against Roswell have gained momentum, as some of the elements of eyewitness stories seem to have lost their credibility. With the passage of time, stories have changed, details have come back unconfirmed, and many hopeful researchers have hit dead end after dead end.
So I got my heart broken a couple of times. Initially, I thought the people with the aliens rolling around in the dust were telling the truth. It hurt to find out they weren't.
Perhaps the most disappointing witness is the late Sergeant Frank Kaufman. For years, Kaufman intrigued Roswell investigators with stories of strange objects appearing on military radar screens and deceased aliens found outside of a crashed spacecraft.
When you start looking at the basic elements of the story that goes beyond the initial find of some kind of strange debris, they all track back to Frank Kaufman. Frank is the guy who really is largely responsible for the guts of the Roswell myth.
Frank Kaufman became a very important source because he seemed to be on the inside. His story was that he was directly involved. He was an important cog in the retrieval operation, that he had access to all the information, and talked about how the bodies were flown out of Roswell and where they were kept and what they looked like and what the craft looked like, and produced drawings of all of this stuff. And unfortunately, Frank Kaufman's testimony doesn't seem to be credible anymore, and that's a real blow to the investigation, because the skeptical community will say, well, you guys believed him, and we did.
Further blows to those seeking the truth about Roswell have been the hoaxes that have grown up around the incident, such as the Ray Santilli alien autopsy film, the so-called secret MJ-12 documents, the photographs that Penthouse publisher Bob Guccione bought for $200,000, which were later revealed to be photos of a prop alien from the film Roswell.
Of course it's going to muddy the waters. People always remember the hoaxes. They'll remember that certain witnesses were discredited. They won't remember that every member of Colonel Blanchard's staff we were able to interview, with a single exception, said this was an extraterrestrial event.
I'm very pessimistic because I've done my darndest with some of these reluctant Roswell witnesses. At least 10 people who are still alive who have direct knowledge but won't talk about it. They're going to go to their graves. One of the original Roswell researchers, Stanton Friedman, has said that Roswell research is a race with the Undertaker. And I'm afraid he's right. I'm pessimistic about ever getting to the bottom of this.
But the will to believe drives other UFO researchers to push forward against the odds. Dr. Dave Rudiak is a research scientist who believes he has found the long-hoped-for smoking gun of the Roswell incident in a photograph that's been in the public record since 1947.
Even though I had believed that something very unusual had happened at Roswell, I was surprised at what I read in here. I wasn't expecting to see some of this stuff.
Rudiak has spent the last 2 years using computer imaging to analyze what Roswell researchers know as the Ramey Memo.
First, there was the Roswell-based press release. About an hour after the press release, General Ramey was already speaking on the phone to reporters in the Pentagon press room and saying it looked like a weather balloon to him and a radar target, and that is in fact what is pictured here. So they brought in the photographer from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He took 6 photos. 4 of the photos have General Ramey, and he's holding this message in his hand. In 3 of those photos, the message is turned away from the camera. In this particular photo, though, for some reason, it's facing the camera. And Fortunately for us, the image is of sufficient quality that we can read quite a bit of the message. And it tells, I think, a very remarkable story.
During the GAO investigation, U.S. Air Force representatives claimed they tried to enhance this photo themselves. Their official conclusion was that even using state-of-the-art equipment, it was totally unreadable.
This is the memo the Air Force said that their high-level government organization photo analysis lab could not read anything on. And if we zoom in here, you can obviously make out some of the words quite easily. Everybody sees this here. This is, the two words here are weather balloons. These words are very important because it tells us that this is about Roswell, because Ramey's trying to sell a weather balloon story to the press. It's not his lunch order, it's not his laundry list, it's not Mrs. Ramey telling him to bring groceries home. All right.
Rudiak's inquiry began by focusing on the most readable key words and phrases.
Here's the word disc, and it's in quotes because there's a new use of the word, and they typically put the word disc in quotes. Another group of words that everybody sees are right here. It's Fort Worth, Texas.
Another key word was identified, both by Rudiak and other researchers who have analyzed the memo.
Up here is a key word that was picked out by the first group. They read this as victims up here. Here's a graphic of this keyword victims. These letters underneath are actual teletype font. I'm just assuming that we have these 4 letters. The question is how many words in the English language will fit that? And here they are. The only word that seems to fit is victims. So the word victims is critical because it's really the first documentary confirmation that there actually were casualties or bodies involved with Roswell. It's all been based on witness testimony up to this point.
Rudiak believes that by piecing together the most legible words and phrases, even the simplest reading of the Ramey memo is incriminating.
Of course, if you have this phrase up here, which is in the first paragraph, says, and the victims of the wreck. If there were victims, this can't be explained by a balloon crash.
When the Roswell crash, startling new evidence returns. Dave Rudiak reveals the full text of the Ramey memo. And archaeologists get definitive word on the weather balloon found at the Foster Ranch. As the sun rises on the final day of the Roswell debris field dig, a police escort leads 2 security vans into downtown Roswell. Their cargo? 66 bags of soil samples and humuos, historical materials of uncertain origin that have been under guard since they came out of the debris field. These samples and artifacts will remain locked in the safe of the Roswell Wells Fargo Bank until they can undergo extensive testing at a materials lab. The mystery's over for one artifact found in the field. The National Weather Service estimates Bill Dolman's weather balloon to be no older than 10 years, and certainly not a remnant of the 1947 Roswell crash.
This is one of 7 known photographs that was taken at Fort Worth Army Airfield on July 8, 1947. This is General Roger Ramey seated here. Next to him is his Chief of Staff, Colonel Thomas Dubose, who later said that this weather balloon that they had displayed was just a cover story that they used to get the press off their backs.
After 2 years of research, Dr. Rudiak believes he has interpreted the entire text of the memo in General Ramey's hand.
So here's the first paragraph. It reads, Fort Worth Army Airfield acknowledges that a disk, again in quotes, is the next new find west of the cordon. If I'm reading this correctly, they found the main disk west of the cordon, and General Ramey is confirming this. And then it goes into this phrase, and the victims of the wreck. You forwarded to possibly the team, some sort of team at Fort Worth, Texas. So you have something in the disk, the aviators in the disk, they were going to ship them by a B-29 special transport, it's abbreviated as ST, or a C-47. I have about 80% confidence in what I have here. I think at least 80% of the words are correct here. I think even if people can test most of the words that I've come up with, that there's enough words that are clear enough, such as in the disk, victims of the wreck, that it puts the lie to the whole balloon explanation, and also to the Air Force's claim in 1994 that nothing could be read in this message.
3 weeks after the backhoe excavation, Bill Dolman returns to the dig site to examine his results. In one of the trenches, he is surprised to find what could be an impact mark, right where the experts said there'd be one.
Something moved the original natural soils and sediments from here at some time in the past, and then it filled back in. It happened long enough ago that this feature was not evident on the surface at the time.
But does any of this evidence bring us closer to solving the riddle of Roswell?
What we have done is find some things that are suggestive, taken soil samples that could be looked at microscopically for some kind of debris evidence. We came up with some surprises. One of them's over the hill and is clearly, to my mind, not a cow path and not an old two-track that's eroded. And it was quite a surprise. Someone could come along and take part of our results, selectively draw upon the results of this study and say that they were offering indisputable physical evidence. But it would not be true. No, we got something that's unexplained.
The Roswell incident has become an integral part of New Mexico state history. Back at the university, Dolman briefs Governor Bill Richardson on the results of the dig.
And the initial impact point was right in here, according to Don Schmidt, who's basically a technical advisor to the project and a leading UFO researcher. The exciting part about this was that, wow, we've got a stratigraphic anomaly right where there should be one.
We've got something, right?
It's intriguing.
I don't think the U.S. government has fully disclosed everything they know. And what I think is important is that we, through science, through the Foster Ranch Project, we get to the bottom of something that's perplexed many Americans.
The question as to whether or not our United States government has actively set up some type of a program that conceals information about extraterrestrial civilization or the UFO phenomenon, I believe that it's absolutely certain. It's beyond just a probability.
I feel that they've been waiting until several of us old white hairs die off who were there. Then they can say anything they want because there's no one to refute them.
In October of 2002, the Sci Fi Channel and former Clinton Chief of Staff John Podesta held a joint press conference in Washington, D.C., demanding the U.S. government release its files on unidentified flying objects.
It's time to find out what the truth really is that's out there. We ought to do it really because it's right. We ought to do it because the American people, quite frankly, can handle the truth. And we ought to do it because it's the law.
The Foster Ranch dig has been a symbolic first step, melding science with what was formerly pseudoscience, the hunt for solid evidence of UFOs on Earth. The team leaves the dig site with as many new questions as answers. Questions which are all the more poignant for those with personal ties to the Roswell incident.
I think it's very important people know about what happened here in Roswell. It happened, and it was shielded and hidden.
I want to know why. what happened. And that's what I want. On birthday, 80 years old, I want to find out before I die.
To say, I hope that we find the truth, we may find things and still not know the truth. But I'm hoping that we make some small difference in the body of knowledge about what happened in Roswell. And I'm having a good time just talking to my dad.
Our solar system is just a grain of sand tucked away in an out-of-the-way place in a very ordinary galaxy. What this has left me with is the knowledge that we certainly are not alone in the universe or even in our galaxy.
The fact of the matter is, it may well be the most important single public policy issue in our entire lifetimes. People just don't know it yet, but they will. I want our people to be prepared for this so that we can take our place as full and equal citizens in a galactic civilization.
While the Roswell mystery remains unsolved, it's clear that the case file should not be closed. Dave Rudiak's reading of the Ramey memo indicates at the very least that the government hasn't shared all it knows about that night in July of '47. The Foster Ranch dig produced unexplained disturbances in the soil and 66 bags of unidentified artifacts, all of which cry out for further investigation. Log on to sci-fi.com for updates on that research. But even if the ultimate answer to the Roswell riddle doesn't come out of the earth at the Foster Ranch, something else already has. The beginning of a marriage between science and science fiction, one that may prove vital as we seek the truth in an uncertain future. I'm Bryant Gumbel. Thanks so very much for joining us.
Next on Sci-Fi, Quest for Atlantis, startling new secrets.
Peter Jackson, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg. Just a few who have taken us to worlds beyond our imagination. Discover what driving force inspired them to become the visionaries they are today.
If I hadn't seen that movie, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today.
Sci-Fi Boys premieres tonight at 11 on Sci-Fi.